J.R.R. Tolkien took from many influences when crafting his pantheon of gods in Arda, the VALAR and MAIAR, the Ainur more generally. Some of those influences are rooted in other pagan pantheons, so which pagan real-world gods might correspond to these? Let's investigate. Before the creation of his Middle-earth, J.R.R. Tolkien famously said in one of his letters, "I had a mind to make a body of more or less connected legend, which I could dedicate simply to England." He was well versed in the Anglo-Saxon myth of Beowulf, with the legendarium of Celtic stories from Welsh, Scottish, and Irish sources, and with later Arthurian and other medieval tales. But these to him seemed to feel like they were missing something, especially in comparison to the vast and epic myths of the Greeks, Romans, and Norse outside of Britain. Beowulf, for instance, was a single Germanic hero with a relatively simple story arc, hardly enough for an entire pantheon of motifs. Celtic stories had most of their pagan aspects and god figures Christianized and humanized over time into what has basically amounted to historical records. And Arthur follows the same logic. A bunch of old pagan ideas and deities being Christianized into a totally new narrative. They lacked a theogony and a true pantheon of gods, something likened to the theogony of Hesiod in Greece, establishing a lineage of the gods, origin of them, and the origin of the universe, really. Although most of his stories, as they're put to writing, ultimately, in Middle-earth, are more like the historical accounts of heroes and kings. Each character tended to represent certain broad themes, like aspects or avatars of the Valar, more akin to Greek, Hindu, or Egyptian, and other more epic ancient pantheons. Sure, Tolkien was a Catholic Christian, and this is often cited as something of a dismissal of pagan motifs within the Lord of the Rings. But this would be a discredit to the pagan roots of Catholicism. Roman Catholicism is at least partially descended from Greco-Roman and Gnostic Semitic paganism. Of course, when we say pagan, we really only say that in context to Christianity, Islam, and possibly Judaism, these monotheistic Abrahamic faiths, which see other religions and pantheons, especially polytheistic ones, as false. And of course, Catholicism being the first major power of Christianity in Europe, is perhaps the most guilty of that sort of paganization, which really just means demonization of everything non-Christian, or in that case, non-Catholic. It is possible for Gnostic Christians to speak of a pantheon of gods in terms of emanations, as it's often called, or aspects of a single god. Most Catholic saints, angels, and demons represent motifs that go back to pre-Christian pagan concepts. This is something that many people discuss and is quite well known, I would say, in this secular age. In my last video on the pagan roots of Santa Claus, I also cover some of these pagan concepts. There are practices throughout the Catholic world that retain pagan roots, like say during Christmas or Easter, that are not biblical at all, and that many Protestants, like Martin Luther himself, thought were distracting and problematic, that they were leading Christians astray into pagan practices. It is actually a Protestant movement which ultimately became more iconoclastic and intolerant of pagan or polytheistic practices because they see angels, demons, and saints as divergent from a personal relationship with God and Christ, not compromising with any other religion or culture or so on. Almost something like a monastery, but enacted on the entire population. This might all seem to be a huge tangent, but it all comes around to Catholicism today, like the Romans before them, and like Hinduism throughout its history, is more capable of integrating foreign pagan motifs into its practices. I think the Catholic influence of J.R.R. Tolkien, especially in the UK that he grew up in, a largely Protestant Anglican country with deep divisions between Protestants and Catholics, says something about him. Not just of the worldview of Lord of the Rings, purely, but of the way in which he's going to compromise his Christian worldview with pagan values and worldviews that are possible to interpret Lord of the Rings through. In the future, I might do a video breaking down the difference between his world and that of C.S. Lewis, who C.S. Lewis was an atheist who turned Christian, and the manner in which he did so, I would argue, is more Protestant. And the mythology, the world building that he did, I think has many really big flaws, but that is for another day. Now, perhaps the most Christian Catholic idea in Tolkien's pantheon is that of Eru Iluvatar, whose name means the one All-Father. Now, that's actually similar to Finnish Father and Vaire in Arien. There's Father is a quite common motif, basically a Sky Father. Now, it's easy to say, oh, that's a Christian concept. But the thing is, Christians weren't the first, and they're certainly not the only religion to have an All-Father. Far from it. Almost every culture on Earth had one, and has an Earth Mother also. If anything's suspicious in Christianity, it is the removal of all the others, including the Earth Mother. That is not true for Eru Iluvatar. There are many gods, or many aspects of him. If I could summarize this with color theory, I would say that Eru Iluvatar is white. Its spectrum is made up of all the colors, but the emanations, the aspects of that whiteness split off into all of the colors of the rainbow, every color, and every color becomes all of the VALAR and MAIAR, the greater and lesser gods, which are all just aspects of a cosmic energy. This conception of a higher god, often a creator god, often a bit more removed from the world, is very common to Gnostic Christian sects and Gnostic Judaic sects and Islamic sects as well. It's also similar to the motif in Brahmanism, or of Brahma in Hinduism, or the concept of Brahman in Upanishads, which is the kind of philosophical addendum to many Hindu and Vedic philosophy. The Brahman being the entirety of the universe, kind of pantheistic, as opposed to the Atman, who is essentially the individual soul of every human being. Philosophical stance of the Upanishads is that the Brahman and the Atman are identical, and that they're two aspects of the same self, that we are the universe, as they say, as is said by many philosophers. Another interesting influence, which has also influenced many of the Gnostic Christian and Judaic sects, is Zoroastrianism. Sometimes Zoroastrianism is named not after the founder of the faith, but after the high god of the faith, Ahura Mazda, and is called Mazdaism. And Ahura Mazda actually has many emanations, which are all of the different virtuous energies, the virtuous kind of ideals of really humanity. Zoroaster saw the dizzying accounts and histories and deities of the Persian and Iranian pantheons, and under the Persian Empire, under Cyrus, sought to unify all of those different concepts into a single philosophy. One of the first supreme deities from the Greeks, and this isn't just Zeus, Deus Pater, or Jupiter in Rome, but actually Hypsistos. Later on, a concept began to grow in Greek philosophy of the One, essentially a monistic belief rather than monotheistic, although they're basically fairly thematically identical. The idea that there is a single high God that brings the world together and makes it harmonious, makes it make sense. There are many philosophers that were disturbed by the idea of so many varieties and so many different gods and so many different pantheons. In their attempt to find the erete, the high principle, the unifying principle of existence, they posited this kind of god. With the name Allfather, it's easy to imagine Odin, the Allfather of Norse pantheon. I don't think Eru Iluvatar has too many real motifs that align with that of Zeus or Jupiter or Odin, because those are not actually high enough. They're kings of the gods. And for that, I think we'll bridge into his first and most important emanation, Manwe. Now, Manwe is a lot closer to Jupiter, Zeus, Odin, to some extent, because he is the king of the Valar, and he's also a king of the stars and the heavens, and he lives atop Mount Taniquetil, which is an epic mountain that is like a ladder, a bridge between the heavens and the earth. It literally pokes out into outer space. This mountain very much resembles Mount Olympus, with the halls of Manwe atop them. But when we look at his counterpart in Varda, another star goddess, we find that this is not really an analog of Zeus and Hera. Manwe is also said to be kind of a sky god, a sky father in his own right, and for that he resembles more Ouranos or Deus, or even Atlas, who holds up the sky as essentially the first king of the gods. As an astral, stellar, or celestial god, the coupling of Manwe and Varda more resembles a kind of Semitic influence with, say, Ashur and Asherah. Ashur is the high god of the Assyrians, Asherah the high sky goddess of Phoenicians and Semitic peoples in general, of which Assyrians are one of. These two deities are much more airy and detached from the earthly affairs of mankind. His name and role also resemble Manitou, Odziozo, Orenda, Wakantanka, and other great spirits in Amerindian myth, although these are also highly reminiscent of Eru Iluvatar too. As a sky god, Manwe almost resembles a lesser magnification of Eru Iluvatar. In Zoroastrianism, one of the most important emanations of Ahura Mazda was Spenta Manwe, who is also a god of stars and of life and light and goodness itself. Essentially, Spenta Manwe is the quintessential man, quintessential human, the good, pure human. That is part of why the Manwe, linguistics is used here, at least in my estimation. Manwe's name, and the fact that he even receives the dead souls of humans, relates him to the motif of the first man in various myths, from Adam of Hebrew to Atum of Egyptian, or Mano of Indo-European, Manu of Vedic Hindu, and many others. He's a bridge between the Brahman, Eru Iluvatar, and the Atman, the everyman, our every soul, our individual potential for goodness and light and life. Even the fate of human souls after death in the world of Middle-earth is actually quite reminiscent of the Upanishads. They are to become one with Eru Iluvatar, and we'll come back to that when we talk about another deity, Mandos. His partner, the Queen of Stars and the Valar, is Varda, who first kindled the fusion within stars to burn brightly, spread light into the world. She also imbued the two trees or lamps with gold and silver light, respectively. The two lamps ultimately evolve into the sun and moon, and this, to me, is a clear reference to the Greek titan Thea, who was a goddess of stars, but also of precious jewels and really all that shines and glitters with promise. The most famous jewels in Middle-earth were the 3 Silmarils, crafted by the elven smith Feanor, harvesting the light of the 2 trees, made by Varda, into Selima crystals. Now, Selima crystals are this kind of magical crystal, which is common in many different fantasies, that essentially allows them to capture light or energy or emanations to something of a talisman to then channel it. Of course, if you want to have a mythology that allows for the existence of the One Ring, ultimately, for a single item or talisman to have that much power, you need to justify it with some sort of fundamental lore about why objects are able to be imbued with such power. And the Silmarils are the first real use of this. And I think that's part of why it's so important and meaningful that the theogony of Tolkien's Middle-earth would be called the Silmarillion, because it really is the fundamental mythological core and metaphor to the One Ring that is the central focus of his greatest work. Now, these three jewels are based on the three jewels of Jainism or Buddhism, representing the three noble truths or aspects of enlightenment or perfection. They're also the basis of Zelda's Triforce and the three Lake Guardians of Pokemon, all representing wisdom, power, and love. Because the Silmarils are a manifestation of perfection, they become coveted. Even Melkor, with all of his malice, did not desire the Silmarils merely for power, but because they really offered for him a sense of peace that transcended his own malice and made him feel more complete. So pure was their power that they led many to fight for them. And this, to an extent, is perhaps Tolkien's reinterpretation of the Garden of Eden at the core of a Christian worldview, that some tempting godlike power or wisdom is available to you in this perfect garden, but comes with a dire cost that carries on in the form of a kind of shame or banishment from the Undying Lands. And so those elves were made to wander Middle-earth and only return to Valinor upon their deaths. One of Varda's attendants, Ilmare, is also a goddess of light, resembling the dawn goddess Aurora, Ishtar, and Venus, among many others. She is a Maiar, as many of the attendants or lower deities. Coincidentally, Venus's husband is Vulcan, whose equivalent in Finnish mythology is Ilmari or Ilmarinen. Perhaps a coincidence. Ilmarinen, the craftsman of the Finnish, created the skies, and Ilmare, a goddess of light, might represent the dawn star. But unlike Venus, Ilmare's husband is Eonwe, the heroic war god of the Maiar. This war god is not like Ares or Mars, however, although Venus is often pairs with Mars too. Rather, Eonwe resembles the masculine counterpart of Venus or Eos in Phosphorus or Eros, or in Hindu Kartikeya, who comes with warrior aspects as well as kind of dawn god youthful aspects. But the strongest motif for me with Eonwe is actually the archangel Michael, who is the warrior of God. Warfare in an Abrahamic flavor has to do with righteousness, with justice, or at least that is how it's perceived. Next we have Mandos. His other name is Nemo, who might be thought of as the twin brother of Manwe, the dark chthonic opposite. Receiving the souls of the dead implicates him with the Hindu god of the underworld, Yama, who was the first person to die, thus gaining rulership over the realm of the dead. Mandos is said to receive the souls of elves who die in his hall in the westernmost of Valinor. The west is where the sun sets at dusk, representing death in many cultures. In Indo-European myth, Mano, who I mentioned before, similar to Manwe, the first man, kills his brother, Yimo, similar to Namo, Mandos, in order to create the world. This is similar to Ymir of Norse. Yimo, like Yama, goes on to rule the underworld, and Mano rules the overworld. The Sky Father, Deus Pitar, and the Dark Father is Dispater. In Rome, the former Deus Pitar is Jupiter, and the latter was Pluto. So that's Zeus and Hades in the Greek pantheon. Despatra actually represents the rich father. He's richer than the Sky Father, because the Sky Father doesn't have objects or things or riches. He is abstract and beyond. He doesn't encumber himself with such things. Rather, he is kind of the king of ideas and thoughts. Despatra, being chthonic, has more aspects of the resources and minerals and powers of the physical world, a little bit akin to the demiurge of Gnostic religion, as opposed to the high god. Now, it's interesting that Manwe receives the souls of dead humans, and Mandos receives the souls of dead elves. Manwe essentially judges and prepares dead humans to become one with Eru Iluvatar, to join him in the celestial realm, the highest spiritual realm. It's through mortality that humanity gains this special privilege. But it's not quite explained what this kind of afterlife is. I suspect it might be something like the dharmic concept of moksha or nirvana, becoming one with the universe, so to speak. Whether through some kind of union with Eru, or through maybe a release from consciousness into oblivion, which is more compatible with nirvana or with a atheistic Buddhist interpretation. In Middle-earth, the elves are never released from samsara, the cycle of death and rebirth, reincarnation. When they die, they are reborn in the Undying Lands and tend to stay there forever. In addition to judging the dead, Mandos is also a pronouncer of fate and the mouth of Eru Iluvatar on the world. He's not morbid like his Greco-Roman counterpart in Hades or Pluto. Rather, he's just honest and candid and resolute. This may actually relate back to a more pagan interpretation of Hades and Pluto, these chthonic gods who have profound wisdom and are great poets and receivers of wisdom, perhaps involved directly with divination. A more Christian interpretation of Pluto or Hades has become quite common between Zeus as this noble, caring, loving, benevolent god in the heavens and this chthonic, evil, plotting Pluto to demonize him and turn him into essentially Satan. I think Mandos is one way of redeeming this original character of Hades. There's more to him and more of value in him than just being a god of the dead. Mandos' counterpart is Vaire, the fate weaver of the Valar. She weaves a tapestry depicting the history of Arda, past, present, and future in the Hall of Mandos. Many mythologies, such as with Arien Rod of Celtic Welsh myth, and Clotho, one of the three fates in Greco-Roman, revere a spider-like fate weaver. Amerindians of the southwestern United States, including the Navajo, Hopi, and even further down south, the Aztecs, revere a spider grandmother who weaved the entire universe into being. I talked about this in my video on the chthonic night goddess. This, to me, also relates to the dreadful spider of the void, Ungoliant in Tolkien's myth, whose existence was unknown prior to her appearance assisting Morgoth in the poisoning of the two trees of Valinor. She relates back to those same motifs of the night goddess, like Nyx, Nott, and Neith, who existed in the void before creation, possibly the oldest deities in any pantheon. Like with Manwe and Mandos as two twins of a similar energy, one celestial and one chthonic, I believe that Vaire and Ungoliant are thematic counterparts, even if that was not the original intention. Of course, this is a situation where some of the dualistic structure in Zoroastrian and Abrahamic religions come to influence the world of Middle-earth, and things are broken down into black and white, essentially, good and evil. Both stem from the same mythological source, but come to represent different characters in this story. Evil is seen and portrayed as pure evil and irredeemable, and good as ultimately victorious and morally pure. This would not be my preference if I were creating a mythology, and certainly isn't in the one I am creating. Now, speaking of pure evil, let's talk about Melkor, or who would become Morgoth. Essentially, the moment he became Morgoth was the moment that he was no longer considered redeemable. He was considered pure evil. Melkor, like and unlike Mandos, does seem to be on the morbid side of things. Although he's not explicitly a god of death, he brings death, almost like a god of plagues. His discordant solo at the dawn of existence resembles gods of chaos in various pantheons, like Set of Egypt, Tartarus in Greek, Chernobog in Slavic, Satan in Christianity, of course. His aim seems to be either to destroy the world or to mutate it into his own twisted vision. What this vision exactly is never quite established. There is no argument for what they are doing. They are not necessarily for anything. And this, from even a secular perspective, there is such thing as a nihilist. And we come to realize there is, in the modern age, more than any other. There are people out there who don't care, and who have lost empathy, and lost the ability or the will to make a better world, to posit something new and alternative, to try to help. They give up, and often they want others to give up with them. They're not motivated by a vision to make the world the way they want to see it. They are motivated merely to attack and criticize and deconstruct what they disagree with or don't understand. That is not to say Morgoth or Melkor does not have certain aspects. He comes to represent volcanoes and even ultimately industry. These forces, which in the case of volcanoes, as with Tartarus in Greek, is a god of chaos, but also of creation. A volcano is eruptive and destructive, but also the volcanism of the earth is what generates the electromagnetic field that helps life to grow on the surface of our planet. Fundamentally, the earth began as a molten rock, and slowly those molten pieces solidified and became the crust. And volcanoes continue to add more of this chaos to the system, allowing the Earth to continue to evolve and develop and change. That dynamism is what separates it from, say, Mars, which stopped producing and therefore slowly died and withered away. It stopped recreating itself. So those are aspects of many deities and many pantheons, even like Pele of Hawaiian, which has a good, or at least ultimate good. The goodness of volcanoes, the goodness of certain natural destructive things might not be seen at the level of the living being or of the society, but ultimately in the long term, from a higher perspective, they are necessary. And this is part of the reason that it is still kind of interesting that Melkor, despite being the enemy of Eru Iluvatar, is allowed to exist and came to exist in the first place. When it comes to industry, I think that his Maiar lieutenant, Sauron, best represents this particular motif. Although Sauron is not the same as Morgoth, he's essentially his avatar in terms of theme. And Sauron also takes on the form of Anatar, a deceptive gift giver of the Rings of Power. As I discussed in my Santa Claus video, of all things, the smithing god as a trickster and gift giver goes back to the myth of Prometheus. Sauron, however, is more demonized, like Satan, without any real redeeming qualities. Although I have my criticisms, as most do, with the Rings of Power show that came on Amazon recently. I found it interesting, although it was a subversion of the original material, that Sauron seems to have a more gray view, not as black and white as Tolkien's writings suggest. He really seems to want to make the world a better place. He seems to want to empower the peoples of Middle-earth to become gods in their own right. He assists the elves in the creation of their rings in order to help them gain independence and power. It's not something that is clearly seen in Tolkien's works, with the exception of the time that he spends in Numenor, corrupting the Númenóreans against the gods of Valinor. In that case, he does seem to take on Luciferian and even Promethean aspects, convincing the Númenóreans to stand up to the gods, even to invade them, and to take immortality, to take godhood for themselves. Now, maybe it is as simple as he only meant for them to fail, that he didn't mean for them to succeed in doing so, although it is hard to imagine that he is so foolish as to really believe that the Númenóreans could have usurped the gods themselves. Now, of course, nothing that he does, his genocide, his corruption and twisting of the orcs to serve him, is redeemable. These are all wholly evil and terrible things. We don't know all that much about his entire life story of Sauron as a Maiar. We kind of just see him as a leader of the orcs of Morgoth in the First Age, and then he returns and leads, basically, Morgoth's forces going forward. Now, like with Ungoliant and Vaire, there is another deity that's very similar to Morgoth, Melkor, Sauron, Annatar, that is not them, but that shares those motifs of the smithing god that I'm talking about. That is, of course, Aule. Now, Aule is not considered evil, like Morgoth is. He created the dwarves without the approval of Iluvatar, and their industrious nature disturbed the natural order at the time, to the distress of Aeule's own partner, Yavanna, whose forests were being exploited for resources by the dwarves. Aule was nonetheless forgiven, and dwarves turned out to be far less greedy and destructive than their orc counterparts. Although one can plainly see the thematic similarities between the two. In other mythologies, dwarves and orcs may not have been distinguished from one another. The Titans of the Greeks, or the Jotuns of Norse, and other ogres and orcs from various mythologies. Of course, in Norse you also have the dwarves, who craft the great magical weapons of the gods. And this influence is very strong with the dwarves of Middle-earth, as Tolkien eventually evolved them into. Nonetheless, they are industrious, they are potentially greedy, and they can exploit resources and cut down entire forests. There are aspects of evil in them, but that is essentially the purpose of Middle-earth in general. Middle-earth is somewhat middle. It's a gray place. Good and evil is not so clear, cut, and dry as it is in Valinor. The elves that live there attempt to spread it. They attempt, almost like some sort of missionaries, to exert the powers of good in a place that is threatened by evil. Wizards being the ultimate example of that. In many mythologies, the smithing volcano god can be both a creator and a destroyer. Sometimes benevolent towards humankind, like Prometheus and Armani, or malevolent, like Surtur of Norse, or neutral, like the Kitsune firefox spirits of Japan. Now, Yavanna, his partner, is certainly his opposite, the valor of fertility, nature, and all of life. In response to Aeule's creation of the dwarves, she requested the creation of the Ents to protect her forests. And after the destruction of the two lamps, she sang the two trees into being. Like Ewa of Avatar, there are tree mother goddesses and gardeners in many pantheons, like Pomona of the Romans, Ukimochi of Japan, whose body sprouted into all plants and animals, and Idun of Norse, or Edain of Ireland. That they sound like Eden is probably no coincidence. They're both fertility goddesses that represent immortality, tending to sacred gardens of the gods that have golden apples or nectars which grant immortality. This Garden of Eden motif is not exclusive to Abrahamic religion. Indo-European myths have a world tree, guarded often by a serpent. China also has a peach tree goddess. The two lamps, which became two trees in Valinor, clearly represent this Eden, something that, more similar to pagan roots, is considered a real place. A place that's over yonder, an other world, but still within our world. The Greeks and Romans spoke of the Garden of the Hesperides to be past the Pillars of Hercules, or somewhere near the Atlas Mountains. The Hesperides, like the Pleiades, are children of Atlas. Atlas as king of Atlantis, as king of the gardens, relating then perhaps to Manwe, and Adam as something of a king of the Garden of Eden. Yavanna's younger sister is Vana, a goddess of spring, flowers, and harmony. Although she also tends the garden, like Yavanna, she is more of a maiden, daughter of the garden. She takes after Eve, Persephone, Flora, and Harmonia, many goddesses of the spring and of flowers and bloom and growth, tended to represent perfect harmony, although again not partnered with Manwe. Orome is Vana's partner, the god of the hunt. He's the hunter to Vana's gatherer. He's also an excellent horseman, and his name plays on the word arrow, since he is good with the bow and arrow as a hunter. He likely relates to the legendary Greek hunter Orion, and also part to the name, or even closer to the Welsh Aeron, most prominently Herne, the English legendary hunter, on horseback, with antlers. He also had a hunting hound named Juan, in Tolkien's pantheon, that is. Dineth, Nessa, or Indis, is another fertility goddess of the Valar, this time associated with the wild nature within us all. She has Dionysian aspects, having to do with joy, happiness, and celebration. She dances in the evergreen fields of Valinor, and can transform into an agile doe. Many of her themes and her very name might connect her with Diana or Artemis, the Greco-Roman moon maiden goddess who protects the wilderness and innocence itself. She also resembles Feronia, a goddess of wild animals. And her dancing in the evergreens reminds me of the motif of Hecate, the triple goddess of the Wiccan pantheon. There's many practices of witchcraft involving dancing in the woods at night under the moonlight. Her other name, Nessa, may connect her to a legendary Irish princess who transformed into a water serpent, the namesake of Loch Ness. But this thematically doesn't seem to resonate her character to me very well. She's not chthonic, she's not watery, she's certainly wild, and perhaps she can transform into many forms, but I'm not entirely sure this was the influence behind naming her Nessa. In Tolkien's story of Beren and Luthien, Luthien was like an avatar of Dineth. Not literally, but at least metaphorically. Beren first saw her dancing in the woods, channeling the same natural beauty and grace as the goddess. And this, ultimately, was an author write-in of his own wife, Edith. Let me explain. Her partner is Tulkas, the powerful and heroic thunder god of the Valar. Although he is not the king of the gods like Zeus and Jupiter, his inspiration comes from them and many other throughout the pantheons of the world. Tlaloc, Tarhana, Thor, especially Indra, Marduk. I cannot help but notice the similarity between Tulkas and Tolkien, not merely in name, but in the pairing of Dineth and Tulkas. If Luthien might be thought of as a kind of avatar of Dineth, then Beren might be thought of as an avatar of Tulkas, as the great hero he is. Also, J.R.R. Tolkien and his wife Edith had Beren and Luthien etched onto their gravestones. Thus, I believe Dineth and Tulkas might also be channeling the characteristics of their real-life counterparts. It is not uncommon for a writer to write themselves or an aspect of themselves into a heroic character. Now, Tulkas is by no means super popular to your average Tolkien reader. He is merely a thunder god that occasionally shows up when he's needed. Manwe is given a lot more press. Tulkas is very strong and very powerful. He comes in at times to totally wreck his opponents. But, of course, if he were doing that everywhere at all times, then it would be a very short story for our villain Melkor, wouldn't it? Nienna is the queen of the Valar and represents the compassion of the gods towards life, elves, and humanity. Her tears have the power to purify, heal, and relieve pain, much the same way as tears do in real life. She represents hope even in the direst of circumstances, a core to the Lord of the Rings story. She even saw the good in Morgoth and suggested his release from imprisonment. Thus, she also represents mercy, forgiveness, and redemption, a powerful motif in particularly Christian worldview. And her motifs resonate with the Virgin Mary, especially since they are given such a high standing as a queen of the Valar, but not explicitly partnered with the king of the Valar, in addition to Varda, who is Manwe's counterpart. There's also Tefnut, the Egyptian goddess of creation, whose spit was used to create the universe. And there are many rain goddesses, like Ran of Norse, who also share some of those motifs, showcasing mercy, hope, the willingness to listen to the prayers of humankind. Rain itself takes place during or after a strong storm front. After a tumultuous storm, it is something of a relief, and this is an aspect that Nienna is not really given. She is not conflated with rain as I am doing, and although Nienna doesn't have a partner, neither does Ulmo, the sea god, but I think that the two are ideal for one another. Ulmo is clearly based on Neptune, Poseidon, or Oceanus, especially due to his trident. He might also be based on the Welsh sea god Lear, and since the Norse rain goddess Ran that I mentioned is to be conflated with Nienna, Ran's husband, Aegir, also a sea god, might also be conflated with Ulmo. It's also easy to compare Ulmo and even the sound of the name to the Yoruba sea god Olokun. The lesser Maiar god Osse is much the same in service of Ulmo, but has a closer relationship to seafarers and humans. He's a little bit more benevolent, similar to Glaucus of Greek myth. Originally a human who's essentially given sea powers and uses those powers to protect seafarers, somewhat like Davy Jones. Osse's wife, Uinen, also a Maiar, is a sea goddess of tranquil seas and peace, very much like Galatea or Aphrodite. Irmo is the god of dreams and visions, and he stewards a mystical garden called Lorien in Valinor. He's the namesake and patron of the forest realm of Lothlorien, which was founded as a secret place to spread the glory of Valinor and Middle-earth, essentially, using nature. Far from vengeance, this was Galadriel's primary motivation in Middle-earth, to plant the seeds of Valinor, to try to purify those lands. As a god of dreams, he resembles Morpheus, Hypnos, Somnus, or Soma, the Hindu moon god of sleep and dreams. Many aspects of Lothlorien and the magic of Galadriel have lunar themes, like the Mirror of Galadriel, used to foresee the future by projecting one's deepest desires and fears. This is a lunar form of divination. Mirrors are associated with the moon because the moon reflects the light of the sun, and this is a metaphor for reflection itself, to connect with one's intuition. I'm also reminded in the gardening aspect of Miyazaki's Totoro, where it's shown that seeds sprout and grow at midnight, aided by hidden fairies in the moonlight, that both the sun and the moon are required for the prosperity of living things, that the sun gives light during the day, but that the moon helps kind of coax the sprouts out of the soil when no one else is around. And last but not least, Irmo's partner is Este, a goddess of sleep, like him, but also of health. She too tends Lorien's garden, especially its fountains. which rejuvenate the other Valar, Maiar, and inhabitants of Valinor. Something of that immortality potion, or nectar that I was talking about. She's depicted in gray, again representing the silvers of the moon, perhaps. Her motifs relate her to many healing and wellspring goddesses, from Hygeia of Roman to Cathda of Etruscan, and her name, Este, despite meaning simply rest in Quenya, implies the eastern direction, which is often associated with deities of the morning star Venus, like Eoster, Eos, Ostara, etc. Given her healing aspects, it's possible to infer aspects of a birth goddess as well. And this would make sense, since the East, dawn, is thought of in various mythologies as where newborn baby souls arrive every day. Tolkien excludes the planets from his fictional world, probably in order to separate Arda in the imagination from our own Earth. Only the sun and the moon remain the same as our own world. When you see the moon in Middle-earth, or maybe in Jackson's Lord of the Rings movies, it's basically our moon, and it's odd. And if they also had other planets, similar to Mercury and Venus and Mars, your mind would be taken away to considering, is this Earth? As a geographer, I feel like I have to point out that the landmass of Middle-earth, at least by the time of the Lord of the Rings, may be based on an Ice Age interpretation of where the land was and where some of the mountain ranges are. Imagine if during some interglacial period before our last Ice Age, there was a civilization or set of civilizations that rose and fell during that interglacial period, leading to the next Ice Age that then led to our rise and ultimate fall. It's kind of a fun thing to think about. Anyway, only two bonus deities I want to mention very quickly. Arien and Tilion are two Maiar representing the sun and moon respectively. Now, often in other pagan mythologies, the sun and the moon are much more ancient and primordial. They would not have been given a lesser status than other deities, say the Valar. They would have been treated as Valar in their own right. But again, the way in which in Tolkien's mythology the sun and moon originate is very unique. Instead of always being there, or being there before the earth, the sun and moon originate as the two lamps, and then the two trees, and then when those are destroyed, their aspects are brought into the sky to light the day and the night, respectively. Therefore, since they originate much after many of the Valar and many of the other Maiar, they are considered young deities. Arien is a female sun goddess, based perhaps on Eonwe of Ireland, the goddess of light, but also is very similar to Erina, who I covered in the Hittite mythology, especially since the name Arien sounds so similar. Now, she's a goddess also of fire and warmth and heat, of course. Now, Tilion, the moon god, is perhaps based a little more on Mani of Norse, or Muna of English. So here we have it, the 15 or so Valar of Tolkien's mythology with their pagan roots and aspects and influences. Now, if you can find any more influences, or maybe even some more stories, feel free to leave a comment and I will talk with you about it. And I've always been profoundly captivated by the world of Middle-earth. It really was my first real deep foray into mythology and fantasy as a child. My cat, Taters, was named after
Po-Tay-Toes. Boil 'em, mash 'em, stick 'em in a stew.
If you also like taters, and you like Lord of the Rings, then you probably would like this shirt that I have. They're available on Etsy at Studio Pandemonia. There will be a link in the description. I'm sure a lot of people just skip past this section. The only way that I can make this worth my time and this can become something is either people to start joining the Patreon or directly through going to our Etsy shop. I know the economy is terrible right now. If you can't afford to give anything, then just give a like or a comment, a subscribe, or the bell to get notified to come help me on all the little lesser popular videos.